How many of you ever, and this is a rhetorical question, you don't have to raise your hand unless you want to, how many of you have ever wept in front of a piece of art? Or at least teared up seriously, yeah? A lot of us. I see nods and something. This particular piece, which is one of a number of Van Gogh's self-portraits, is in the Art Institute of Chicago. And when my friend Michael heard that I was doing a talk on Van Gogh, he said, "Hey, I got to tell you a story." He said, "I struggled with severe depression for 2 years." And he said, "I'm not talking about I felt bad." He said, it was like I couldn't hardly get myself out of bed. I could hardly get myself into the shower. And when I was done showering, I had to stand there and gather the energy and wherewithal to actually be able to emerge from the shower and towel myself off. And he said, "It's interesting, the thing that turned everything for me." He said, "I was in Chicago, I was visiting the Art Institute of Chicago, and he said, this painting literally pulled him out of depression." And he said, "I've never struggled with it to quite the same level before." So I'm suggesting to psychologists and counselors that you might want to hang one of these up in your room. But he said, what I saw is a man who there was a lot of pain in that face. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety, and yet somehow I could identify with that. I could identify with the sorrow, and yet somehow there was also something hopeful that was happening in that work. And I think Vincent van Gogh would have been absolutely filled with pleasure to have that kind of response to his painting, because that's exactly how he saw what he was doing, was creating work that would comfort, heal, and transform people's lives. I'm not going to argue tonight that he was an Orthodox Christian throughout his entire life. I could make that case, but I also think equally I could make the case that he wasn't an Orthodox Christian. He was a Christian of some sort, but not maybe not a biblical Christian. But what I want to show tonight is that his work demonstrates a really powerful spiritual vision, one that ultimately is founded upon Jesus Christ and his connection with Jesus Christ. So let's trace a little bit of his journey. We'll do an inadequate job of telling his full life story, but we'll look at some interesting moments, and we'll also look at some paintings. His paintings have sold for record numbers, amounts of money. Until, I guess, this last week, a Monet painting has eclipsed it now. But his Irises, which was bought by the Getty for a long time, was like the most anyone had ever paid for painting. And we're talking millions, in double digits of millions of dollars. But he lived in absolute poverty and destitution most of his life, rarely being able to manage much more than coffee or alcohol and a loaf of bread for meals. Many of his paintings have become absolutely iconic. Probably some of it, and not many of us have a jacket, but there are mugs and magnets and everything you can think, stationery, everything with Van Gogh on it. He's one of the most recognizable painters in our time, and really his paintings are icons. But in his life, how many paintings did he sell? One. He struggled with undiagnosed psychological issues most of his life. Specialists have attempted to diagnose this illness. They've thought it may be schizophrenia, epilepsy, syphilis, alcoholism, lots of different ideas. And so he was a man who was constantly struggling with a mental balance. But the vision that we see in his paintings is work that is beautiful, great beauty, a balance, a sense of peace and calm sanity in his work. He's the man whom Henri Nouwen, the great spiritual writer, considered among the great spiritual guides of modern times. He called him a wounded healer. But he was somebody who was never comfortable with institutional religion, and in his lifetime he only painted a handful of really explicitly religious works. Welcome to the enigma. That is Vincent van Gogh. If we're to take him seriously, I think first thing we have to do is rid ourselves of the mythology. Okay? What's the mythology about Van Gogh? Here was a mad genius who cut off his ear and then committed suicide, and that his work, that really this madness was the source of his genius. And I think that kind of view really gets in the way of really fully understanding what his work is all about and what it has to offer for us. It's really unclear what the psychological issues were that he dealt with, though we know that they began to manifest themselves after a really stressful and disappointing time in his life, when he had invited Paul Gauguin to come down to Arles, and they were going to start an artist colony. And the two managed to do whatever the exact opposite of hitting it off is. That's what happened. And in a huff, Gauguin finally got tired of the whole thing. Gauguin was a giant egoist, but the two of them came to blows. It's possible. One theory is that actually it wasn't Vincent that cut off his ear, but maybe actually it could have been Gauguin who cut off his ear, because Gauguin had a sword that he liked to flourish. But after this period, these symptoms really of illness began to really manifest themselves. Seizures, hallucinations, and self-destructive behaviors, like actually ingesting paint. Not recommended. But the interesting thing is that the times in which Van Gogh was doing badly in terms of his psychological health are times when he found it really difficult to paint. And the times when he was doing well, that was when the real creativity came through and the great paintings happened. His work has, psychologists have looked at the kind of painting that's done by people who have like schizophrenia and that kind of a disorder, and there's nothing in Van Gogh's work that really suggests that. What his suggests is a mind alive and creative. And then there's the whole thing about killing himself. And, modern scholarship has begun to ask some questions about that. Did he actually kill himself? His wound was here. Now, think about that. You're right-handed, and you decide to kill yourself. How do you kill yourself? Gun to the temple, gun in the mouth. You do not shoot yourself in the side. And the other interesting thing is that the medical reports that have come to light recently have shown that the issue was the bullet was lodged in his body. Well, most people who do this kind of forensic work would tell you if you point blank shoot yourself, the bullet will almost always, especially here, will almost always come out the other side. So there's lots of theories. We can talk about that during Q&A if you want. I spent too much time on it already, but I think it's fascinating to think about even that part of the myth may not be true. It may be as a result of an accident, some young kids who were playing with guns. All the evidence is there that it's possible one of them might have shot him and that he was covering for them, because that's the kind of person that he was. So let's put these myths aside and let's judge the work outside of the myths. The painting themselves, I think, show a sane, powerful, and usually serene vision of beauty and great joy. And they reflect a faith in God that is really central to who he was as a person and the work that he created. He saw his work as an artist as a vocation. It was a calling from God. So let's explore the spiritual journey that unfolds in his work and in his letters. So first, that's his spiritual foundations. Vincent was born in 1853 in a small town called Groot Zundert in the Netherlands. Both his father and his grandfather were Dutch Reformed pastors. He comes from a lineage of clergy. They were part of a movement that was kind of evangelistic. It was very socially conscious, and it was also kind of non-dogmatic in its theological stances. So he grew up around that, and I think that had an impact throughout his life. At age 16, he began work as an assistant for an international art dealership, people who would sell paintings all around the world. And he worked for a while in the local shop, and then he worked for a while in London and in Paris. And of course, he began to become more and more exposed to art. He'd shown some facility toward art himself as a child, but had kind of not done anything with it. So while he was away from home, that's when he began this lifelong process of writing letters to his brother Theo, who the two of them were very, very close. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the letters, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of letters between the two of them. And really the only time they weren't writing letters to one another was when they were living nearby. They really depended on each other, and letters became the way that they discussed. And the wonderful thing is, for us, is that these letters give us an insight into the man, his faith, his philosophy about life, that really is deeper than almost any other artist I can think of. So they're quite the gift we have. Here's a photo of Vincent at age 18. At age 22, in September of 1875, he experienced a really significant spiritual awakening. The faith that had not necessarily burrowed its way down into his heart that he'd grown up with really did. And he began to embrace a really passionate, zealous form of evangelical Christianity. At this point, his letters were filled with biblical quotations and quotes from the books that he was reading. And among the books he was reading were books like Pilgrim's Progress, the published sermons of Charles Spurgeon, the book The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And he began to see his life as a spiritual journey, and that his faith in Christ was primary to his life. He writes this about the Bible at that point, at 1877. I cannot tell you how much I sometimes long for the Bible. I read something out of it daily, but I would so much like to know it by heart and to look at life in the light of that word of which it is said, Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. He especially was taken by the Sermon on the Mount, and he decided he would take it seriously. He wanted to use that as the model for a way to live, not just nice religious ideas and aspirations. He said, "To follow what Jesus taught mankind will be the purpose of my life." He got a job working in a religious boarding school in London and also worked as an assistant to a Methodist pastor. During this time, he also briefly studied for the ministry. He was never a good student. He loved to read, but he was never a good student. And he wasn't really interested in theology as an academic exercise, so he failed out pretty quickly. But still, the pastor that he was working with gave him opportunities. And in 1876, he actually got a chance to preach for the very first time. And he wrote this to his brother Theo. I just think this is kind of wonderful. He said, "I felt like someone who had risen from a dark vault underground into the kind light of day when I stood at the pulpit. And it is a glorious thought that from now on, wherever I go, I shall preach the gospel." So his philosophy at this point in time, this is written in Amsterdam in 1878, "Happy is he who has faith in God, for he shall, although not without struggle and sorrow and life's difficulties, overcome in the end. It is good to go on believing that everything is full of wonder, more so than one can comprehend." It's interesting, this kind of simple faith did not survive into his later years. But these two themes, I think, stayed with him for the entire rest of his life. The belief, first of all, that great joy could be found even in the midst of suffering, that suffering was not without purpose, that suffering moved us forward in life. One of his favorite scriptures that he would quote often was Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:10. Anybody know that one? "Sorrowful, but always rejoicing." That's how Paul described himself, and that is how Vincent thought about himself. And then, secondly, the belief that one should embrace the wonder that can be found all around you. And then, so as he begins to create art, this embrace ends up being his new vocation. But first, let's say something, since we're here in a great books college, right? Let's say something about reading, because Vincent was a voracious reader. I love this little painting here, by the way. Still life with French novels and a rose. He was a voracious reader and read very widely. But what he particularly enjoyed, other than the books on the spiritual life that he was reading, were the contemporary novelists who brought social injustice to light. For example, George Eliot, many of whose novels show the struggles of working class people. Victor Hugo, who, of course, deals with the theme of injustice in Les Miserables and in other of his works. Harriet Beecher Stowe, about whose Uncle Tom's Cabin, Vincent said this: "There is so much slavery in the world, and in this remarkably wonderful book, that important question is treated with so much wisdom, so much love, and such zeal and interest in the true welfare of the poor oppressed." But his favorite probably was Charles Dickens, who he discovered he learned to read English. Actually, he could read several languages, and he learned. He so loved reading Charles Dickens novels. He felt that Dickens had, as a writer, the eye of an author, the eye of a painter, and the way he described the world was almost painterly. And he also felt great empathy and companionship with the characters in Dickens' novels, especially those who were working for extremely low wages in very unsafe conditions in the new factories of the industrialized Britain. Books like Hard Times, for example, are a wonderful example of Dickens taking those on. So this thing that was part of his father's faith, this becomes an important part of his faith. So in 1878, when he gets the chance, since he hasn't done well trying to study to become a pastor, he lets him know, though, he does want to serve God. So he gets assigned to a temporary position as a lay evangelist working among miners in Belgium. And what he found there when he arrived in Belgium to work with these miners is that their conditions were terrible. And a little bit of that I think is captured in this drawing. The miners, he found, aged prematurely. They struggled against hunger and frequent illnesses. Many of their children also worked in the mines. They would have the children haul it out. And abuse was rife, of all kinds of abuse. It was common because there was so much unsupervised isolation in the mines. It was a terrible conditions. They were the kind of conditions that Dickens had pointed out as problematic. So he decided he wasn't going to be like the typical missionary of his time. In this point in time, if you were a missionary, you'd go in, you'd have a nice home, in somewhat close proximity to the people then you were going to minister to. But as a guy who takes the Sermon on the Mount seriously, he decides, I'm giving away everything I own. And so he did, because he wanted to identify with the same kind of hardships that these miners lived with. He slept in a hovel, on a bed of straw. He tore up his clothes. He didn't have that many, and what he had, sometimes he would tear up to use as bandages. He refused the luxury of soap. Probably not the best idea. And he was usually disheveled, soot-faced, and emaciated. In other words, he looked like the miners. He identified with the miners. The suffering Jesus was his model. His goal was to be a friend of the poor like Jesus was. The miners loved him. They took to him pretty quickly because he was gentle and humble and compassionate. He would nurse injured miners back to health, and he would care for their practical needs. As a preacher, he left a little bit to be desired. He was not very talented, but interestingly, he did win a number of converts through just his simple care and love. He wrote in 1878, "Experience has shown that the people who walk in darkness in the center of the earth, like the miners in the black coal mines, for instance, are very much impressed by the words of the gospel and believe them too." And interestingly, it was during this time that he begins to play with art. He always sees things, so he begins to record them through his art. Well, after 6 months, the mission organization did not renew his appointment. They very unceremoniously let him go. They pointed to his lack of eloquence in the pulpit. But he was more interested in living out the gospel than he was in preaching it. He said, "They think I'm a madman because I wanted to be a true Christian." Well, he tried to stay on even though he no longer had any funding. Guess how that went, right? At this point, he lived in even worse poverty. All the support was gone. He managed to get a little bit of money from his family to keep surviving, but I think this soured him on the church. And at this point, he turned his pretty much permanently on institutional religion. There's no record of him ever setting foot in a church again, although he did have some friendships with clergymen late in life, interestingly enough. But his break was not a break over theology, but it was due to, I think, his deeply personal disappointment, his hurt, and his anger. He approvingly quoted Victor Hugo, who said, "Religions pass away, God remains." So after this disappointment, he begins to think about how his spiritual passion can be channeled into his artwork. And so he began to develop as an artist, but continued with his desire to live out a vocation for God. It's just that vocation now was to create art in which, as he said, God might be found. His summary of his belief at this point, that God of the clergyman, he is for me as dead as a doornail. But am I an atheist for all that? To believe in God for me is to feel that there is a God, not a dead one or a stuffed one, but a living one. He embraces a God not found in theological formations, but in the mysteries of human existence. And he's here, and I think this really captures his artistic philosophy as he begins to develop. He said, everything that is truly good and beautiful in man and man's works, everything of a moral, inner, spiritual, sublime beauty, all derives from God. Try to understand what the great artists, the serious masters are ultimately saying in their finest work. God is in it. So his first really finished works, which begin to emerge, are somewhat hesitant and tentative. If you look at his early work, it's mostly paintings of inanimate objects. Cabbages, clogs, pipes, mugs, and fruit, usually against kind of a muddy brown background. His style was the best kind of rustic realism that he could manage. And his palette was almost all earthy kind of brown tones. If you look at a Van Gogh painting, you can oftentimes figure out exactly when in his life it was painted because a shift occurred. Then he went to Paris. And in Paris, this, by the way, is the view that he painted out his window. And of course, in Paris, this was the time in which the Impressionists were beginning to make such an impact. And they made an impact on him. And suddenly, his own work began to take on a whole new look and feel. The brushwork was livelier and more vigorous. He was influenced by the way that, especially late in his life, that Rembrandt, who he loved, would lay on paint with loose and vigorous brushstrokes. And he began to be taken with their color, the way that they use color. In his paintings, Vincent began assembling a world out of brushstrokes and leaving the evidence of that process right there on the canvas. He was interested in how colors worked as complementary colors against one another, what that did to the eye, and how they would like vibrate when they were set next to each other, like when you would set blue next to orange, or red next to green, or yellow next to violet. Something happens on the color wheel. The opposing colors, when you put them together, something powerful happens. He discovered that. He also, at this point, discovered Japanese art and was really taken with Japanese art and influenced there by their use of color, by their shifting kinds of perspectives, by the decorative kind of flatness that you see in Japanese painting, and by the importance of black, which the Impressionists almost never used black. But he learned that black could be a powerful color in itself. And this, I think, brings us to his mature work, which is generally marked by vigorous brushstrokes, vibrant colors, and a rough finish that reflects light off the canvas. You've got to see a Van Gogh live to understand how this works, but I thought at least this gives you kind of a reminder of what that vigorous, thick application of paint would do, because the light would work off of the canvas and off of these colors. So let's look at some of the emphases, characteristics that I think are mature Van Gogh's, show in the mature Van Gogh's work in terms of his spiritual vision. The first is empathy. We already kind of talked about his empathy in his lifestyle, and he wanted to bring that to his artwork. He saw that the message of the Bible, that it was deeply entwined with compassion for the poor and the oppressed, and that our response should be to love and serve them. Another of his favorite scriptures, Matthew 11:28-30, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden." So between 1878 and 1885, many of his drawings, his paintings, are of miners and laborers, weavers, peasants, and farmers. And we see this subject matter, especially throughout his early work, though it never completely disappears. Compassion was not a theory, it was not an ideal, but it was a manner in which he saw a person should live their life. But he realized that what his art could do is shine a light upon the conditions of the poor and the overlooked elements of society. He was waging a war against indifference. He became increasingly convinced that his art could provide comfort and vision. He once expressed, I really love this, he once expressed the desire that his paintings, quote, would hang not in museums, but in the homes of workers and the poor. It always strikes me, he wrote, that whenever we see the image of indescribable and unutterable desolation, loneliness, poverty, and misery, the end or extreme of all things, the thought of God comes into our minds. At least it does with me. And to look at just a few paintings real quickly that kind of show this feel. I mean, this one, Head of a Peasant Woman. What is she feeling? I'm not going to call any, just verbalize. Exhaustion. Despair. Desolation. Maybe world weariness. Hopelessness. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole story in that face. There's a whole story in that powerful face. You think about what her life is like, or what the life is like of this woman, this peasant woman digging, another early painting. I mean, you think about doing this kind of labor hour after hour, backbreaking. But somehow in his paintings, this kind of work is given a sense of dignity. His first, this is generally considered his first masterpiece. And it portrays a peasant family illuminated by that single source of light. There are 3 generations here living together, and they're sharing this frugal meal. You can tell that they're impoverished because of the surroundings, but also because of what's on the menu. Potatoes. And only potatoes. Yeah, I was make a joke they'll not make. But there are things you can do to dress up a potato, but this isn't that, right? This is a frugal meal. And the weariness and the burden of their lives, I think, comes forward in the kind of exaggerated facial expressions that they have. It shows his deep empathy and compassion for these poor peasant workers. He wanted, as he wrote to Theo, to express the reality of these people, quote, tilled the earth themselves with these hands they are putting in the dish, and they have honestly earned their food. The palette is all dark and somber earth tones, as it was in most of the early work, but I think that only enhances the sense of heaviness and weightiness of this piece of work. Following his father's death, and his father and he were somewhat estranged at the point when his father died, because he really was not finding a way to make a good living for himself. But in honor of his father, he painted this, the still life with the Bible. Interesting. What do you see about the candle? It's out. It's extinguished. Kind of a symbol of death, a memento mori. And then we see the big book, the Bible. And next to that is a paperback edition of an Émile Zola novel. Zola, another favorite writer who dealt with social injustice issues. And while his father saw no value in modern fiction, it was something they would argue about, Vincent read both the Bible and fiction and saw the same kind of prophetic message in both of them. He wrote, "I see things differently in the Bible than Father does, and I cannot find at all what Father draws from it in his academic way." Interestingly, if you can look close enough, you'll see the Bible is open to Isaiah 53. What is Isaiah 53? The suffering servant, Jesus as a suffering servant. And this was really his vision of who Christ was, but it was also his vision, I think, his awakening to this vision for himself, that whatever suffering is experienced in your calling, it's a gift to bring peace and comfort to others. And I think this work both honors his father and makes a statement about a new direction he's going. Secondly, he wanted to paint the sacredness of the ordinary. He saw the most ordinary objects and landscapes and faces as subjects that were worth his time. And when he painted, he would paint quickly to capture that kind of immediacy of what he was feeling and experiencing as he was viewing. He said, if people say that it was done too hastily, you can reply that they looked at it too hastily. Our tendency is to look at things too quickly and then pass on. Those who study how our brain functions have discovered something they call repetition suppression, which means that every time we encounter something again, our brain displays less of a response to it. We become familiar with things and we cease to really pay attention to them. Repetition suppression. There, you got a word for it now. And with that predictability, we lose our attentiveness. We stop paying attention. Familiarity breeds indifference. And through his work, Van Gogh was attempting to overcome the indifference of the eye and evoke a sense of the real presence of the object that he was painting. He said it's looking at things for a long time that matures you and makes you understand more deeply. He was teaching us, and continues to teach us, how to look, how to see. Art is a process of purifying our vision so we might see in a new and fresh way. And so he sought to expose the inner illumination in the very simplest of things, whether it be people's faces, plants, fields, a pair of shoes, a sunflower. He sought to find and paint the unique inner heart of a thing. He said in a letter to Theo, and now when each one of us returns to everyday life, to everyday duties, let us not forget that things are not what they seem to be, that God is using the things of everyday life to instruct us in higher things, that our life is a pilgrimage and that we are strangers on this earth, but we have a God, a Father, who offers shelter and protection to strangers. The point was, I think, that by studying small things, you learn to see the larger realities of the created world. His famous painting of a pair of shoes, which at first you might say, why would you paint a pair of workman's boots? But isn't there a story here? Isn't there these shoes are telling a story. He didn't need to paint a face to portray emotions of sadness and suffering. You see those in those shoes. You can imagine the life of the person who is wearing these shoes, how they lived, what they did. There's a story here. And so we can see through these boots maybe that grace is not only found in big events, but sometimes grace is also found in the smallest and most ordinary things. Coleridge, the poet, spoke of the goal of his poetry as an attempt to, quote, disimprison the wonder in the ordinary. To disimprison the wonder in the ordinary. I love that phrase. And perhaps not as profound, but worth quoting to Andy Warhol, said, you need to let the little things that would ordinarily bore you suddenly thrill you. It teaches us to look and to see. It helps us to discern what matters, what needs our attention. Remember the great poet Gerard Manley Hopkins? The world is charged with the glory of God. And that is what he was painting. And that charged world is sometimes in the simplest of things. The stunning immediacy that's produced through color. And in a painting like this of his bedroom, I think there is a calmness and simplicity of effect here that we see in many of his works. And these simple items gathered together tell a whole story about a life. And there's something almost where it works almost like a religious icon, and that you look at it and you look through it to deeper realities. He said at one point, "I think I see something deeper, more infinite, more eternal than the ocean in the expression of the eyes of a little baby." Or this painting, The Cradle Rocker, where you as the viewer are kind of placed in the position where the cradle would be. He said, "I want to say something consoling like a piece of music. I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which in the past was symbolized by the halo, and which we seek to convey by a radiance through the vibrations of our colors." And then there's the revelational power of nature. I think that flows naturally from that. I think that he saw the truth of Romans 1:20, that for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world now are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. In 1883, he wrote, "What I think is the best life, without even the slightest doubt, is a life that consists of long years of being outside, dealing with nature, and of the something on high." That little phrase, "something on high," is one that he repeated a number of times during his work. And later he wrote, "I have a terrible lucidity at moments, those days when nature is so beautiful." And in 1885, "In any case, whether people like or don't like what I do and how I do it, I, for my part, don't know any other way than to wrestle so long with nature until she reveals her secret to me." And I love that thought that a lot of his work is that wrestling with what's in front of him, trying to see the deeper thing that emerges. He saw nature through eyes of reverence and awe, and he brought forth the energy and the vitality of the created world through his eye and through his unique artistic style. I think his work at its best sometimes is a hymn to creation. "I see," he said, "that nature has spoken to me, has told me something that I have written down in shorthand." And then he captures that with a flurry of brushstrokes. Whereas Monet was interested in the play of light on objects, that's what his work really is all about, is how light reacts with the objects that he's painting. Van Gogh's doing something different. He's interested in the light inherent within objects. And so instead of painting light on, he's painting, I think, the light that emerges from objects. And one of the powerful ways he does that is through the intensity of his colors. I just threw this one in because this is not a very well-known painting, but he went through a short period in which he was kind of painting like an impressionist. I look at that and I think, he could have easily not gone any further and been remembered today as one of the fine impressionist paintings. But for him, it was only a stage on his pathway. But even here you see this love and appreciation for nature. But more typical is like this painting this is a painting of the garden in the monastery / asylum that he checked himself into late in life when he was really struggling. It was a fitting place to be for someone who considered himself both an artist and as kind of a sort of a monk. He was really struggling with mental health issues, but I think there's a peacefulness and contentment and a renewed connection with nature that we see in in a painting like this. Or if you've been to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, you've probably seen his painting of the irises. Once again, so close up. We're seeing the subject is the irises themselves. They're not just a little add-on. They are the key subject. Nature is seen in its intimacy. Or this painting of cypresses. I think we see both the passionate comfort that he received from nature and also a reflection of the inner turmoil that he was experiencing at times in this painting. In one letter, he refers to cypresses as, quote, torches of the soul. I like that phrase. Or this painting, which I think definitely shows the influence of Japanese painting, just very simple painting of an almond tree. But all of it revelatory, God seen and glimpsed through the beauty of nature. When it came to painting, he had a different thing that he was about trying to do. He was not drawn to traditional religious painting where you would paint sacred stories. He disliked most paintings of Christ. Didn't think they captured it. He thought that he would rather paint his own spiritual insight than create narrative paintings or heavily allegorical images. He wanted to paint the divine presence in ordinary things instead of painting the sacred stories. These two paintings, not by Van Gogh, the one on the left, anybody want to guess? Paul Gauguin. And interestingly enough, it kind of looks like Jesus is sort of a self-portrait. That tells you kind of everything you need to know about Gauguin. The one on the right is Émile Bernard, another painter, one with whom he became really good friends. And there's a whole collection of between the two of them talking about art. And one of the conversations they carry on is about the meaning of religious art. Well, both of them painted these two paintings of Gethsemane. And Vincent decided he would try his hand. And every time he tried it, he ended up scraping the painting off, scraping the image away from the canvas. He couldn't capture what he wanted to. He reacted with revulsion, really, to Gauguin's painting and was highly displeased with Bernard's. Their image of Christ left him cold. And so he, in one of his letters, urged them to refrain from biblical interpretations. Among other things that he particularly disliked was the ineffectiveness of Bernard's olive trees. So what he decided he would do to paint religious painting is he turned to painting a series of 18 paintings of olive orchards, his own version of the Garden of Gethsemane story. There is a dominant, in all of them, usually there's a dominant and radiant sun, which was always a common image of divine presence in his paintings, and a sense and a source of God's nurturing love. So this is his religious painting, in a certain sense. Catherine Powers Erickson, who's written a fine book on Van Gogh, said he was reluctant to paint a realistic representation of Christ because he felt Christ was too important a figure to paint without proper models. So he adopted a symbolic vocabulary. For him, sacred art is determined not by its subject matter, but by its way of seeing. His only finished image of Jesus was a copy of a painting by Delacroix that he did in the final years of his life, the Pietà. And he was going through a period of really struggling. This was partly during the time in which he was really struggling with his mental health. And so it was easier just to create his own versions of other people's paintings. And he did a handful of those, some of Mallet and others. But because it has his own feel and flavor to it. He wrote this, he said, and I love this quote, "Christ alone of all philosophers, magi, etc., has affirmed sensible certainty, eternal life, the infinity of time, the nothingness of death, necessity of serenity and devotion. He lives serenely as a greater artist," talking about Jesus, "as a greater artist than all other artists, despising marble and clay as well as color, working in living human flesh." We are his artistry, is what he was saying. Jesus was the artist who worked with the medium of human beings. And this is the first of 3 late-in-life paintings that were these copies of favorite paintings by Brennan. This one of the Good Samaritan, after a painting by Delacroix. And this one, his work by Rembrandt, The Raising of Lazarus. And what he's done that's interesting is he's replaced the figure of Christ with this blazing yellow sun as the symbol of divine power. And he's used his own facial features on the figure of Lazarus. In other words, he was taking a biblical theme here and making it autobiographical, adapting it to his own personal story, probably making reference to his own hope of rising out of the darkness of mental illness and returning to life. That was his hope. And lastly, there was the longing for eternity. The eternal question, he said, life visible to us in its entirety, or do we know only one hemisphere before we die? He also wrote, "At all events, it does not strike me as impossible that cholera, kidney stones, cancer, and consumption should be means of celestial transport, just as steamers and railroads are earthly ones. To die peacefully of old age would be the equivalent of going on foot." And so this theme of the closeness of eternity and a longing for eternal life begins to show up. This is a reworking of an early painting he had done years before, and it was a time in which he was losing the struggle during against his mental issues. He returned to this image. Perhaps it summarizes the tragedy of the human condition as it sees the inevitability of sorrow and of death. But by its title, I think it references the hope that lies on the other side of death. Here at the very gate of eternity, we await a consummation of hope and love and life. Or this painting, The Sower, and he did several versions of The Sower, laboring under the divine light of the sun, planting something now for a future harvest. It's that nourishing light of the sun that shines on all of our endeavors. To Bernard, Emile Bernard, he wrote of, quote, "Yearnings for the infinite of which the sower, the sheaf are the symbols, they still enchant me as much as before." This is a painting about renewal and hope. And then one of his very last paintings, Wheatfield with Crows, is a painting that many have interpreted as dark and foreboding. And maybe it is. I think he spoke of it saying it was an expression of loneliness and sadness. But also he thought it offered hope of healing and of restoration. That the birds are taking flight. The crows are taking flight is important to that. A baker who gave him a place to live for a short period of time wrote this about him. He said, "On a very hot day, a violent thunderstorm burst over our region. What did our friend do? He went out to stand in the open field to look at the great marvels of God, and so he came back wet to the skin." Here we might see hope in the midst of darkness, a road leading into a distance surrounded by wheat ready for harvest as the crows fly heavenward. Is it maybe a longing for eternity? Certainly, a longing for eternity can be seen in this very famous painting. If you ever get to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the shocking thing is how small this painting actually is. But the moment you stand in front of it, it is a moment you'll never forget. It was a tears of my eye moment for me. This painting, I think, feels strangely alive. A night sky that's living, spinning, swirling overhead, stars that shine and shimmer, a pulsating mystical vision. Notice that the lights are on all over town, but what about the church? No light from the church, interestingly enough. That's not where he's looking. But he paints what is kind of, I think, a pulsating mystical vision. In my 75 masterpieces, I say about that, I write, it is as though we stand at the very threshold of the place where the temporal and eternal join together in a great swirling dance. And it's painted with these thick, churning strokes. And he said, or wrote, when I have a terrible need of, shall I say the word, religion, then I go out and paint the stars, which is exactly what he did. He captures the great beauty, the sacred presence, and the surging power of the eternal pointing toward, or being pointed toward in the natural world. It's music in the night sky, swirling and alive. To the end of his days, Van Gogh was unafraid of using the language and the metaphors of Scripture. He often referred to the, quote, something on high that inspired and comforted him, something greater than himself. He said, this is one of the quotes he's most famous for, I always think the best way to love God is to love many things. Love a friend, a wife, something, whatever you like. You will be on the way to knowing more about him. That is what I say to myself. Though he turned his back on institutional religion, he still retained a sense of that mystery that lay at the bottom of everything. He saw glimpses of the divine all around him, and he wanted to share with others the traces of beauty and healing and meaning and love that he found surrounding him. Perhaps Van Gogh offers a spiritual vision to counter our cynical, materialistic, and mechanistic modern mindset. He offers us a world where there's more than originally meets the eye. Perhaps Vincent can teach us to see the world around us with new eyes, to recapture the sense of wonder and the sense of openness to the God who created it. Thank you. So, any thoughts, questions?
I'm curious about the sources for the quotes from him. Were most of those from the letters to Theo?
Almost all of them are from the letters to Theo. A few of them are from letters to other people. There are a number of different editions of his letters out there, and it makes really wonderful writing. Henry Nouwen was asked, what do you think are the most important spiritual books of the modern times? And one of the 5 he listed was the letters of Vincent van Gogh. Yeah.
What was happening to all the works as he was producing them?
Very good question. So, Theo was worked for the same art dealers that Van Gogh failed out with. And Theo believed in his brother Vincent. And in fact, most of his life, Theo regularly sent large sums of money. And that's how Van Gogh kept himself alive, because he wasn't selling paintings. But he was sending the paintings to Theo. And Theo was trying to sell them. And the interesting thing is, just not long before his death, everything was going well for him at the time of his suicide, maybe not. He was beginning to get recognized for his work finally. A critic had written a very glowing description of some of the paintings. But then he died. And Theo and his wife were left with a house full of Van Gogh paintings. And Theo died within a year of Vincent dying. And Jo, his wife, if she's the reason that we know what we know of Van Gogh. She found the letters and got the letters published, and she began to promote his artwork. And it's I would have loved to have been there. After he died, they laid him out and held a wake, and great artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and Bernard and others, I believe maybe Monet came and to see him, and they had him laid out, and then they had some of his paintings surrounding him in the room. And all the other artists remarked upon what an amazing gift and talent he had. There's a lot of argument about who is the first great modern artist. And you could certainly make a case for Cezanne, but in a certain sense, I think you can make a case for the fact that Van Gogh opened up something a little more radical than what the Impressionists were doing. That was intensely important to artists that came afterward. So I'm sorry, that was a long answer to that question. I did answer the question, didn't I? Because I do have a tendency sometimes to, yeah.
Thanks, Terry. Question. So, do you have a sense of what Van Gogh thought of the art of the past, that of the generations that came before him?
He was a great lover and appreciator of art, although he was not a big fan of a lot of the religious art of the past. He found it to be saccharine and not very effective. So not a fan. He loved Rembrandt, though. Loved Rembrandt. Millet, the painter Millet, was one of his very favorites. Delacroix, he loved his work. But sometimes that people think about artists as like they're these highly creative people. They're not like intellectually that gifted. But Van Gogh was very culturally aware. He was very well read. And as you read his letters, you see him not only describing his own paintings and how he's feeling, but also just remarking on a lot of interesting topics. So there was a brain there as well, not just creativity. Anybody else? So of the paintings you saw, what was your favorite? Was there one that stood out to you? I mean, we ran by them so quickly, it doesn't do justice, but...
I like the boots. Is that weird?
No, not at all. I think he would have liked that answer. Yeah. What do you like about the boots? See, this is the unfair thing. You try to help me out, and then I put you on the spot.
I don't know. They had such character. They were so cool looking, and they told a story, and I guess I liked the fact that they were unique and told a story. So maybe it's the
that's
message
the way I
in the
respond
boots
to it.
I was appreciating rather than the boots.
Yeah.
The picture.
Yeah, but the boots too, they open up a whole world, don't they? And I think that's sometimes what a good painting does. Recently reading a theologian who was talking about art, and he made a statement. At first I didn't know whether I agreed with it or not, and the more I've thought about it, the more I find I do agree. He says the best way to approach a painting is to treat a painting like meeting another human being. In other words, when we meet someone, we take in the fullness, and then we begin to learn them. We don't just say, "Oh, okay, Elliot, now on we go." You get to know, and that a painting opens itself to you oftentimes the same way that another human being opens itself to you. Anybody else have one they liked? Or another question, whatever.
No, I'm partial to the bedroom.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's because I saw that at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and it was one that, standing in front of it, the brush strokes that you were talking about, the thick paint,
Yeah.
and I just was so moved by the colors and the texture of that painting when I saw it. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on is in Starry Night, the church not having the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
The other painting that moved me to tears in Paris was the church at Auvers,
Oh, yes.
which captures that so beautifully. The storm around it, the darkness in front of it, but the light kind of on the outside of it, but
Yeah.
not on the inside of
But
it.
on the inside,
It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
It's the print that I brought home with me. It's on
Oh,
my wall in the
okay.
living room.
yeah.
But yeah.
I got brag. My daughter actually she got what do you call those little figures that are they're like collectible. They have like the big heads.
Those things are called pops.
Yes, yes. So she got one of those and she repainted the face that was on it to be Van Gogh. And she did it in little short choppy strokes and then attached him to a little black box that's about this big and created inside of the box the bedroom. I wish I had a picture of it. I should have brought a picture of it. And she was very careful to make sure that the way that the fabric fell on the towel was exactly right. The only different thing she did is she changed up what the paintings were hanging in there and made them a couple of family pictures.
I wonder what the paintings were in the bedroom, whether they were his own.
I believe they were. He would surround himself with his own work. He found his own work nourishing to him. Yeah. But he also loved the work of other artists, especially Millet was somebody who put a lot of. There's a painting called The Angelus that's very famous. It's a man and a woman standing out in a field. Their heads are bowed. In the distance, you see a church. And obviously what has happened is it's that moment where the bells have gone off to say this is the time to stop and pray. And this very rural couple, there's just this dignity and this beauty and peacefulness to that. And that was a favorite of his. Also was a favorite of Salvador Dali, interesting enough, who did weird takes on it. Yeah.
I really liked
Yes.
and what I found most interesting about it is that he found just as much interest and just as much importance in the flowers that he found in people, and he put that much importance on them. And I think that a lot of people fail to recognize that, is that there's just as much importance in the things that God had created as there is in people, and they don't give that the respect that they need.
Very well put. Very well put. I do think that the same kind of energy that he invested in like a human face, and he did wonderful portraits. Even just looking at the self-portraits he did throughout his life is an amazing thing. That was a cheap way to paint when you couldn't afford a model. All you needed was a mirror, and you had your model. But the geography of the human face, says so much. And I think that same thing he invests in the flowers, whether it be the irises or the sunflowers, both of which are very iconic. And if anyone been to the Getty Museum in LA, that's a little bit closer museum to get to. That painting is there. So if you're in north of LA, it's worth the trip. Yeah.
I have to tell you, when they had the exhibit of one of his crows in the field in Honolulu at the museum there years ago, they didn't have the kind of security, at least in Hawaii, that they would have now. So I was in a room basically by myself, and they had one of these velvet ropes, and the security guard was around there, and I was in tears. I mean, just seeing his picture, and then
Not recommended, but
not
I
very
understand.
many people
I
have
understand
done
the desire. Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I love to, when I travel, I go to art museums quite a lot. That's something I love doing. And I've more than once have been asked to stand back. You're getting too close. I say, hindsight isn't that good. But sometimes you have to see the life that's put there with the brushstrokes. I mean, that's one of the things I love about a lot of more modern painters, is that a lot of the older painters, the ideal oftentimes was that you wouldn't see the brushstrokes. You would just see everything would be smooth. And it's kind of like sculpture. It's like comparing like Greek sculpture, which is polished and beautiful and white, although it originally was not white. It was actually painted in rather gaudy fashion, probably. But now what we see is this, white alabaster feel. And then you take a modern sculptor like Rodin, and you can literally see the thumbprints, because as he's worked it, he's left behind the evidence of the artist at work. And I love that idea that in art, we're not only painting something, but we're also expressing something of ourselves. And we can leave those little. There's a wonderful Monet. Once I'm off track, there's a wonderful Monet painting that he took his canvas down to the beach to paint the seaside, and the wind came up, and while he was painting, and he kept on painting. If you look at the painting today, you can see sand, and you can see a place where he reached out to Eddie, there's a thumbprint where he reached out to catch, probably when it began to tumble over from the wind. Anyway, so use this information. Anything else, or so? Well, thank you for being a group and share something I'm passionate about. So.